This channel is part of the History Hit network.
Louis XIV. So powerful, he took his name from the sun itself. So dominant, he made the haughtiest aristocrats bend to his will. So insatiable that no one mistress could satisfy him for long. Throughout a long and turbulent life, Louis sought magnificence in all things. He strived for it in love, in battle, and in art. But above all, he wanted magnificence at Versailles by creating a building so spectacular it would outshine any palace on earth. Taken from intimate memoirs and official records, this is the story of how a king's obsession created one of the wonders of the world. It started in a swamp. It was here, in a stretch of mosquito-infested marshland, that Louis, the 27-year-old King of France, decided to construct his new palace, near a small and unremarkable country town called Versailles. His courtiers were far from impressed.
It was almost as though Louis had deliberately picked the worst possible site for his magnificent palace in order to prove to the world that his will was greater than nature.
Louis had a sentimental reason for choosing Versailles. It was the site of his father's old hunting lodge, and as a boy, he'd played and hunted here.
The original chateau of Louis's father was on top of a hill. The problem, if you wanted to turn it into a whacking great palace, was that you weren't going to be building on flat land. Louis was told this is not a great place for a big expansion of your father's chateau.
As a monarch with absolute power, Louis wasn't used to being told what to do, and he didn't much like it.
Dépêchez-vous d'en finir, Monsieur Sylvestre. Le temps vous est compté. Cette demeure ne va plus rester longtemps en cet état.
From the outset, Louis was thinking big. He started by hiring the greatest architect of the age, Louis Le Vau, to transform the hunting lodge into the palace of his dreams. Louis was to devote much of his energy to his new project, but he was always sure to make time for his other great passion. Although married to Queen Marie-Thérèse, he had numerous affairs. His current mistress was a young aristocratic beauty called Louise de la Vallière.
Tu me feras croire que ces insectes ont mauvais goût. Ils nous ont piqué vos endroits les plus doux.
Mais c'est que je souffre horriblement. Et l'envie de me gratter est terrible. Là. Et là, sire.
Louis's attitude towards women was one of tremendous enthusiasm. He really loved women. He didn't just love them for sex. He loved their company, he loved their conversation, he loved their elegance. He loved women who were witty and refined. Most of all, I think he loved women because they teased him, they made him laugh.
Et là aussi.
Où ça?
Regardez, sire. Et là.
He had a tremendous sexual appetite. He would quite often, if his mistress was too slow in taking her dress off, have a turn with her lady's maid while he was waiting, or a passing servant in the corridor at Versailles. He made love the way he did everything else, with enormous gusto.
A French king was expected to have a mistress. It sort of symbolized the virility of the nation. And, you know, 100 years later, poor Louis XVI, the French were furious with him because he didn't have a mistress. Louise de la Vallière was Louis XIV's first official mistress. She was a lady in waiting at the court. She was guileless, charming, daughter of a good family, and she adored the king, and it was irresistible because she convinced him quite genuinely that she loved him for himself, and I think this is what the young king wanted to hear. I think he had a very good time.
Louise was very important to him. He did love her. They had 2 children together. He made her a duchess. But it was a young man's crush rather than a profound passion.
Whatever his feelings for Louise, Louis was always careful to fulfill all of his obligations to his wife. His marriage to Queen Marie-Thérèse was politically vital. It had ensured peace between France and Spain for many years, and he needed to father children with her to ensure that his dynasty lived on.
Louis did feel a duty towards the Queen. He made love to her frequently, and she would always have a special mass said the day afterwards, and everybody would nudge each other at court because she'd look very pleased as she came into the chapel. He was attentive to her, polite to her. They had children together, but she simply didn't have the looks or the education or the spirit or the charm to captivate a man like that. She accepted his infidelity, as did most royal and aristocratic women of the time, as being part of marriage.
Louis' mosquito-bitten courtiers also had to accept their king for what he was. Like all 17th century monarchs, Louis believed himself appointed directly by God.
Bien sûr. Messieurs, sachez que j'ai nommé notre premier valet de chambre, M. Bloin, conseiller en notre Conseil d'État.
C'était charge nouvelle, sire. L'un de nous l'aurait volontiers accepté.
M. Bloin a notre confiance. Il nous plairait grandement que maintenant vous l'écoutiez.
Nobody could tell him what to do. He was quite simply the only power in the realm. And having had this consciousness since he was a very, very small child, I think it meant that he was, without any arrogance or hubris, of the opinion that he was pretty much a god himself.
History Hit is a streaming platform that is just for history fans, with fantastic documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. We've got unrivaled access to the world's leading historians, with hundreds of documentaries featuring everything from Boudica to the British royal family. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Real Royalty fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use code REALROYALTY at checkout.
As a kind of living god, Louis liked nothing more than being the centre of everyone else's attention.
Louis was brought up in a theatre-mad age. As a young man, he took dancing lessons, which seemed to have completely transformed his self-confidence. He was actually a very accomplished dancer, and he clearly enjoyed greatly taking part in these performances, which were mainly in front of a court audience.
La troupe des astres s'enfuit dès que ce grand roi s'avance. Les nobles clartés de la nuit qui triomphaient en son absence.
I think all his contemporaries were extremely impressed by him. He was astonishingly handsome, with his long golden hair and his almost cherubic face. He was indeed God-given, as his mother, Anne of Austria, called him.
Louis liked dressing up, and not just for fun. It was part of his public image. He chose as his role model the Greek god Apollo, represented in classical imagery as the sun.
Aujourd'hui, nous prenons pour corps le soleil, qui est le plus noble de tous les astres, et qui, par l'éclat qui l'environne, par la lumière qu'il communique aux autres astres, est assurément la plus vive et la plus belle image d'un grand monarque.
Louis was very interested in the sun as a symbol.
Il ne s'écarte et ne se détourne jamais.
It's a very powerful symbol because it sheds its light everywhere. It's obviously very beneficial, but it's also a symbol of domination because all the other elements are subordinate to the sun. He's in a sense above everything.
Monsieur Lully, ne devrions-nous pas ajouter à ce costume quelques plumes et boules dorées pour rendre ce soleil plus flamboyant?
The Sun King seems to be an appropriate title. It was one that was a piece of propaganda when he was young. But like many bits of propaganda, I think it became fat.
Lavau's plans for the remodeling of Versailles were complete and ready to present to his demanding boss.
Louis certainly knew that what he wanted was a building which had that shock and awe effect. There's absolutely no doubt that he wanted a building that would be sensational.
Lavau's model was impressive, but had a major flaw. He planned to destroy the old hunting lodge.
C'est là un bâtiment entièrement nouveau, Monsieur Levaux.
Assurément, Majesté.
The idea of Louis XIV was to keep always the little chateau of his father. So that was a problem for an architect, because architects prefer to destroy everything and to build a new building. So Louis sent the architect away and he told him, I want this little chateau preserved.
Vous devez construire, mais en agrandissant le bâtiment d'origine. Il me plaît de vivre avec la mémoire de mon père. Faites en sorte que vos plans préservent son château.
With Lavau sent back to the drawing board, Louis turned his attention to the landscape. He wanted to expand the existing garden, adding ornamental lakes and groves lined with dazzling fountains. But he'd picked an awful site.
There were no views, it's hemmed in by the sides of a valley. And also, Versailles wasn't naturally endowed, the region, with the sort of trees which Louis wanted for his garden.
Louis's chief gardener was the century's most celebrated landscape designer, André Le Nôtre. Versailles would be the greatest challenge of his career.
Comment vous en rendre grâce?
En nous donnant avec vos jardins un avant-goût du paradis.
But the Sun King did not want to wait for his earthly paradise, or for his trees to grow from saplings.
Louis XIV wanted results, and he wanted them fast. This was really a theme of the whole sort of Project Versailles. And the solution was to uproot mature trees from other parts of France and bring them in, and a special contraption was invented, a horse-drawn contraption, which would allow these mature trees to be transported on, as you can imagine, these terribly bad roads from other provinces.
With major new building work on hold, Louis instructed Lavau to upgrade the interior of Versailles. On his inspection tours, Louis was accompanied by his entourage, including Mistress Louise de la Vallière. But Louise now had a rival.
Madame, faut-il aussi que je vous laisse ma place?
Il se pourrait, madame, que ma place soit bientôt la vôtre.
Monsieur Levaux, sont-ce bien là des miroirs de Venise?
Les miroirs de Venise n'ont pas d'égal en pureté, sire.
Nous n'en voulons pas d'autres. D'autres miroirs déformeraient le reflet de ces dames qui nous accompagnent.
After a while, he became quite bored with Louise, and she hung around at court desperate to try and get his attention back. She never really did. So I think she probably suffered quite a lot.
I think the king could pick and choose. Power is a great aphrodisiac, and a crown even more so. So naturally, I think he picked very beautiful women.
Louis liked to display his power. After winning a war against Spain, he celebrated with a huge party in the gardens of Versailles. It was also a chance for the king to show off the woman who had now replaced Louise as his favorite mistress. Her name was Madame de Montespan, and she was one of the most beautiful women in France.
Madame, le roi s'inquiète de ne pas vous voir encore à ses côtés.
Je ne saurais me présenter décoiffée devant Sa Majesté. Et puis un peu d'attente me fera encore plus désirer.
Montespan is such an attractive figure, I think. She was a tremendous goer. She loved everything to do with pleasure. She loved jewels. She liked marvellous clothes, she liked food, flowers, gardening, and above all, she liked sex, you see, and he did too. So he found absolutely the right maîtresse en titre for him. And she knew about having wonderful feasts and about having entertainments. So she was exactly the kind of person Louis envisaged as being suitable. At the same time, she was so beautiful that ambassadors thought she contributed to the legend of the Sun King.
The Sun King's festivities were about more than pleasure. They had real political significance. Louis was slowly turning his new palace into the most important and the most fashionable seat of power in Europe.
The parties at Versailles, they've been described as pagan masses. Fireworks, rides along the canal in gondolas, balls for 3,000 people under the stars, plays, ballets with 100 dancers by Lully. Everything you could possibly imagine all at once in this tremendous circus of celebration for the king. The great parties were intended to show the nobility and the rest of Europe how powerful the King of France was, what wonderful artists he had, what wonderful musicians, how superior his court and his culture were to every other court and culture in Europe.
The king's former mistress, Louise, eventually gave up trying to win him back. After years of neglect, she decided to enter a convent, leaving behind the children she'd had with Louis.
I don't think she felt guilt about leaving them behind because she knew that they were going to be very well treated. So I don't think she felt that kind of guilt because I think her big guilt she wanted to expunge with penance and fasting and all that in the convent. And when she finally got away, I think she was much happier. She became a very hardline nun, you know, haircut, hair shirt, praying and repentance, and generally ended her life more or less in the odour of sanctity.
Because Louis was spending more and more time at Versailles, he decided to move his entire government there. To accommodate the new officials, Levaux suggested a brand new idea, keeping the old hunting lodge, but enclosing it with massive new buildings on 3 sides. The design was known as the envelope.
The chateau was preserved, but it was enveloped in this new building in a completely different style, which looked like a palace. What he also did with Levaux was to build pavilions for his ministers. Now, this was very important. What this meant was that for the first time, Versailles could function as a seat of monarchy, a place from which the king could govern.
Building the envelope was a massive task, requiring thousands of workers.
The largest number of workers were 40,000 people at the same time. It was a very dangerous place also because the work to be done was not done in a secure way, of course. It was with accidents and people dying.
Louis was impatient to get the job done quickly. Work went on day and night.
There was no health and safety regime, and the workers who were most at risk were the ones who were working high up. So, for instance, the roofers, the carpenters. We do know that there were a lot of accidents on site.
Femme, laquelle d'entre nous n'a pas un mari estropié, un frère défiguré, un éclopé sur ce foutu chantier?
And there were times when the death rate, the mortality rate was high, and in order not to demoralize the workforce, the corpses would be removed at night.
Louis' mistress, Madame de Montespan, was already married, but that didn't stop her spending most of her time with the king, and he made sure she got the VIP treatment.
She had a suite of 20 rooms, whereas the Queen had to make do with 11. They were gorgeously appointed, and he spent a lot of time in them. They included a bathroom, most unusual for the time, in which apparently he and Madame de Montespan spent many happy hours.
Despite her elevated status, Montespan found it hard to share Louis, even with his own wife.
J'ai cru que vous aviez eu un malaise. À l'ordinaire, vous ne restez pas aussi longtemps auprès de la reine.
Ne vous inquiétez pas, madame, mon cœur va bien. La reine a des droits que nous ne saurions lui retirer.
I don't think she was really jealous of the Queen, because after all, she had everything of Louis' real love, and she knew it. But I think she made scenes about the other mistresses when they came along as the years passed. And I think there are some men, possibly Louis among them, who rather like it if a woman is jealous and shows signs of caring. You know, she certainly complained like mad if she felt he was strayed from what was, in fact, an illegitimate relationship.
Louis kept a close eye on the building works. But one inspection visit brought a nasty surprise. A mother, angry at the death of her son, killed on sight, was waiting for him.
Eh ben v'là un monarque qui saigne le peuple de France. Et pourquoi? Pour sa propre gloire. Eh, votre majesté, je vous maudis, vous, et votre Versailles.
We're told that she just let fly at Louis XIV.
Et je maudis ce chantier où tous les jours les chariots se remplissent de plus en plus de morts. Tyrans!
I mean, he was very surprised. He said, "What, is that me?"
Et lâchez-moi! Putain de chien! Tyrans!
Est-ce bella de nous que cette femme parle?
Ne l'écoutez pas, cette femme a perdu l'esprit.
This was a courageous thing for this mother to have done because there were guards everywhere. And of course, as soon as she had said this, she was very quickly hustled away for her punishment.
Une bonne administration de la justice exige qu'une indemnité soit versée à cette femme comme aux autres. Mais cette même bonne administration de la justice exigeait tout autant que cette femme soit punie pour l'outrage qui nous a été fait. Car personne ne doit penser pouvoir s'en prendre impunément au roi.
Le Nôtre's ambitious plans were finally taking shape, and Louis's dream of creating the most spectacular palace in Europe was slowly becoming a reality.
Louis's great gardener, his real gift, was for rearranging the landscape, basically, and dividing it up on a grid, and then you treat the units within the grid essentially as outdoor rooms. And then you would bring in all sorts of other people, water engineers, sculptors, architects, essentially to furnish these rooms.
Si, l'idée serait d'ajouter un nouvel axe au Grand Canal.
On dirait la Sainte Croix. Voilà une pieuse idée de la géométrie, monsieur le nôtre. Elle nous ravit et nous apportera bonheur.
The envelope around the old hunting lodge was complete. Louis's ministers were installed in their new apartments, and the king began governing from Versailles. Now, Louis decided he would make the palace his permanent home, and insisted that leading French nobles come and live there too.
Allons, il est temps maintenant que l'on prenne toutes les dispositions pour que Versailles devienne la demeure du roi de France.
There's no question that for Louis, the nobility, particularly the great court nobility, were an essential aspect of his kingship. They surrounded him with glory and status. This is a state where the ultimate decider on granting favor or refusing favor is in the hands of the king. If you were looking for a military command, if you were looking for favors for many of your clients, supporters and family, then the way to achieve this was by getting access to Louis, and to a lesser extent by gaining access to the ministers around Louis.
But housing all the nobles would mean yet more building work. Louis's finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, worried about the cost.
Du grand commun à l'aile du Midi, faites en sorte que tous trouvent la place qui leur revient.
Versailles manque d'appartements. Sire, il va falloir encore construire.
Bien, construisons, Colbert. Construisons. Si le roi est à Versailles, si rien ne peut se faire en France sans passer par le roi, toute la noblesse sera à Versailles.
Louis wanted the nobility at Versailles in order that he could keep an eye on them. The message he wanted to give to his nobles was this: you don't need to rebel to get what you want. What you have to do is come and pay your court to me.
Sire, voici le château en son état.
Original architect, Louis Levaux, died before his project was complete. His replacement, Jules Mansart, had ideas of his own.
Mansart had the great idea to have big wings each side of the envelope to make some accommodations for the princes and the court. So it was a huge design, and I think he had a greater idea of what would be a great palace for a great king.
Si votre majesté veut bien se donner la peine de se pencher sur l'une des fenêtres, elle verra alors notre projet plus en détail.
Mansart's most ambitious proposal was to build a fabulous gallery lined with mirrors.
En réfléchissant la lumière du soleil dans la galerie, ils ne laisseront plus aucune place à l'ombre. Elle aura toujours vue sur les jardins.
Monsieur Mansart, nous apprécions grandement votre art.
Sire, merci.
However magnificent the plans, Louis's experience with his builders was a familiar one. Everything took much longer and cost far more than the estimates. And they made a terrible mess.
Nothing is more false than these gracious pictures of Versailles. It shows this stately place with everything perfect, you know, everybody gliding about. Actually, it was a huge building site. All the court ladies complained about it. The workmen starting at 6 a.m. My dear, the dust and the smell of wet plaster which got into their hair. It's exactly like today, exactly like what we feel on a tiny scale when our neighbours go building.
Jamais nous ne délogerons. S'il y en a qui ne délogeront point de Versailles, ce sont bien les maçons.
Must have been an amazing sight. I mean, the first day in at Versailles. Everybody stops jostling, jostling, jostling for bigger rooms and better rooms and a better position. In the meantime, the lesser folk, you know, they were trying to get down from the attics, get better rooms, always to get as near as possible to the king.
Impossible de s'y retrouver. Pas un endroit qui n'a été modifié 10 fois.
En architecture, Sa Majesté ne sait que faire et défaire.
Ce Versailles ne m'enchante guère. Il est sans âme.
At night, there was this sort of great unrolling of mattresses all over the palace as servants and soldiers, guards, would, they'd go to sleep on the floor. The lavatory arrangements were pretty kind of basic. Servants would think nothing of relieving themselves in the corridors of Versailles. So you have this extraordinary attention on outward appearances and magnificent clothes, but alongside you have all these smells. I mean, you could have been in a farmyard.
Avez-vous trouvé votre logement?
Oh, pas encore, madame. Dans ce fourre-tout et ces cul-de-sac, je n'ai pu trouver que la grande galerie.
Alors,
I think many of the nobility would have resented the chaos and lack of order, and doubtless complained about this at length. But I think one shouldn't underestimate the compulsive desire of most of the great nobility to attend at court, to be around the king.
Louis's desire for magnificence extended to every aspect of his life, especially his wardrobe. He dressed in the finest cloth and expected his courtiers to do likewise. And when his hair began to recede, he adopted the fashion for elaborate wigs.
A half-inch of lace on a cuff, a gold or a silver button, whether your pearl was here on your collar or here, these could mean life and death to the courtiers. Fashion was hugely important, and it was a very important way for the aristocracy to distinguish themselves from the ordinary people. Louis influenced fashion to some extent. When he was a young man, he dressed quite flamboyantly, lots of cavalier silks and laces and ribbons. He was a bit on the short side, so he introduced a fashion for high-heeled shoes. His mistresses, perhaps, were more influential on fashion. Madame de Montespan invented various outfits, including one, the glorious déshabillé, which was a sort of tunic worn over trousers. And she invented this because it was very easy to take off. Normally, a lady's dress required two women to stand behind her to undo all the strings. And of course, Louis was an impatient man. He couldn't be bothered waiting. So she invented this outfit so that he could undress her discreetly and easily in private.
With so many courtiers now craving his attention, Louis kept them busy by turning his daily activities into public rituals.
When he gets up in the morning, that's the royal lever with a great queue of great nobles who hand him different articles of clothing. At night, it's all reversed. It's the royal coucher, and he takes things off and gives them to nobles. Great nobles would quarrel with one another as to which of them had the right to hand him his shirt, because it had to be the person of highest rank in the room.
They couldn't go off to the country on their estates and start raising armies, meddling. It meant that they had to stay there, quarrelling about whose turn it was to give the king his napkin.
Even the king's mealtimes turned into a performance, where the nobles stood and watched the king eat, waiting for him to speak to them.
One of the phenomena of Versailles was the sight of leading nobles adopting these very deferential poses. This was actually a very, very powerful signal that the monarchy was back in charge.
For the courtiers, flattery became a way of life.
For instance, one courtier, a great nobleman in his province, Louis says to him, "When is your wife's baby due?" And this nobleman says, "When your majesty wishes it."
As well as accommodating thousands of courtiers and officials, Versailles was also used by the king to promote France itself.
There was a deliberate intention to create a showcase for French manufacturers and to rival or outdo Italy above all, which was the great source of taste in the 17th century. The magnificence of the interior, of course, it was all about the splendor of the monarchy and the splendor of Louis XIV. Louis personally loved rich materials and fine craftsmanship. But it was also a careful orchestration of Louis XIV's, France's claim to lead Europe in terms of taste and the arts.
As building progressed, Louis commissioned hundreds of paintings, sculptures, and other decorations, many containing images of himself as the embodiment of French glory. This was no accident.
If you compare Louis with rulers before, it is remarkable how he had professional advice. So he's not presenting his image by himself. There was a whole backup team of intellectuals, writers. This is a real innovation, that there should be a small committee of people who are simply working on how to present the king's image in the most grand manner possible.
The great French painter Charles Lebrun was recruited to the cause.
La voie royale qui se dessine sous vos yeux, sire, conduira chacun de vos sujets de la guerre à la paix, de l'obscurité à la lumière, des forces du chaos à la victoire de l'ordre et du bien.
Vos peintures nous sont chères, Monsieur Lebrun.
Louis's image makers liked art that presented him as a conquering hero, drawing on figures from ancient mythology like Jupiter and his favorite, Apollo.
The association with the images of very powerful men of the past were part of the strategy of being the best king and the most powerful and most important king of the time.
Louis's public image may have included a fair amount of 17th century hype, but he was certainly a remarkable man.
He goes hunting 3 times a day. He goes to council meetings 3 times a day. He's a very hard worker. He makes love 3 times a day. We must conclude the man had amazing energies.
Louis's restless pursuit of glory and magnificence found expression in the gardens of Versailles. But even the king could not change the geography of a region that was critically short of running water to power the hundreds of new fountains that Le Nôtre had installed. And so, when the king took a stroll, his gardeners had to turn the fountains on as he approached, and then off again once he had walked past.
Où allons-nous trouver notre eau, monsieur?
The problem of getting supplies of fast-running, high-pressure water were never adequately solved. Various attempts were made to find alternative sources from quite far away from Versailles. The celebrated Machine of Marly, a series of vast water wheels which were intended to bring water up from the Seine and deliver it to the Palace of Versailles. This provided water, but not enough. The great and final scheme involved building a full-scale Roman-style aqueduct. This was abandoned as being too expensive, and the result, of course, was that the great gardens of Versailles never had enough water to drive all the fountains simultaneously.
Fortunately, there was enough glass to furnish the palace's most ambitious development, the result of 6 years' intense work. This was Mansart and Lebrun's most stunning achievement, Versailles' Hall of Mirrors.
Personne n'en croit ses yeux. Tout le monde pense rêver.
C'est que, madame, en quelque endroit du monde cette galerie n'est en rien comparable.
I think the effect of the gallery is more a dream. Wonderful light given by the mirrors, and I think it's very impressive and astonishing.
Versailles est un triomphe, sire.
Versailles is undoubtedly one of the great palaces. Louis would have wanted us to think of the chateau as an integrated whole, not to focus on specific items, whether the Hall of Mirrors or the Great Canal. And as an integrated unit, it completely outshines, I think, almost every other palace ever conceived or built.
Quelque chose déplaît-il à Sa Majesté? Tout est bien comme vous me l'aviez promis. Toutefois, il nous plairait que cette galerie soit ouverte au public, comme le reste du château et des jardins. Ils sont la fierté du royaume de France. Faisons-les partager au monde.
Louis said of his house, Versailles, c'est moi. Louis was Versailles, he was his house. If we understand one, we understand the other.
The king wishes to assert his authority and maintain his position. He has to do it through display. Versailles is an ideal theatre set on which he can act out what he regards as his royal duties. Versailles, from this point of view, fulfills those requirements better than almost any other building that could be imagined.
Louis's love affair with his palace lasted longer than any of his human relationships. After 14 years, 9 pregnancies, and 7 children, Montespan was beginning to lose her looks and her hold on the king.
Madame de Montespan began to fall out of favour because, inevitably, after 9 pregnancies, her figure wasn't quite what it was. She became rather blousy, she drank too much, she gambled too much, she made a nuisance of herself with her tantrums, and I think, as happens to a lot of women, the more she felt her man slipping away from her, the more needy and clingy she became. And the more needy and clingy she became, the more she drove him away.
Sire, vous n'avez plus un seul moment pour m'écouter, alors que j'ai tant de choses à vous dire.
Plus tard, madame. Un autre jour.
But I think Louis was also undergoing quite a significant personal transformation. He was becoming much more religious. Madame de Montespan was a married woman. Committing adultery with an unmarried woman was one thing, but double adultery was sacrilege. It was a tremendous scandal, and he was becoming conscious of the fact that his way of life was really compromising the state and compromising his kingship.
Louis turned to a very different woman, Madame de Mantanong, governess to his illegitimate children. Mantanong was pious, quiet, and intelligent, qualities that a middle-aged Louis had come to admire.
Poor Madame de Mantanong had to do everything. She had to act as a cook, a plumber, a gardener, as well as a teacher and a nursemaid. It was exhausting. And she did this so well that Louis began to pay attention to her. He noticed this intelligent woman, this calm presence. Slowly, slowly, Madame de Mantanong began to seduce the king.
Calmez-vous, madame.
Me calmer!
Rejected mistress, Montespan, was distraught.
J'étais loin d'imaginer.
Allons, madame. On dit que la Mantanong est plus dévouée à Dieu qu'à Sa Majesté. Notre roi va vite se lasser de ses prières. Il aime trop la chasse, la fête et la beauté. Croyez-moi.
Vous êtes sûre?
Mais oui, madame.
I think it was the rise of Mantanong in the first place which really riled her, because she found she'd made a mistake. She'd underestimated another woman. Mantanong was poor and a widow and innocuous and very pleasant and intelligent. And she didn't spot that Louis might actually fall in love with a woman like that, you know, and it might be a very seductive thing to him in quite a different way from her own seductive powers. And I think for a couple of years at least, she was extremely angry.
When Louis's long-suffering queen, Marie-Thérèse, died, he was free to marry again, and he turned to the quiet governess. She'd not only won his heart, she'd convinced him she could help save his soul.
The 17th century mentality was very different. The attention paid to salvation, dying in a state of grace so you didn't go to hell, was enormous. And Louis, who in some ways was quite simple, took this very, very seriously. And I think Mantanong persuaded him that she could help him towards his salvation.
As Mantanong was a commoner, the king could only marry her behind closed doors.
He did need a secret church wedding, a morganatic wedding, as they're called, in the presence of clergy and witnesses. After that, he's all right with God and the church. He can go to communion, it's all perfectly okay. And it's interesting that Louis never declared the marriage, because she wasn't a princess. He had his own values. That is, he would have his private life, but in public, he was solitary.
In public, Louis concentrated on running his palace. And his court life at Versailles became ever more formalized.
I think the establishment of the full court at Versailles really turned it into the great social, political, power-broking centre of France.
Versailles was exciting if you thought like a French nobleman, because Louis XIV was your host. You would spend the evening in the physical presence of the King of France. You would be admitted to his gaming table. You would be invited to dance in front of the king. Now, for nobles, this was an enormously prestigious and enormously flattering thing.
The court of Versailles could be seen as a cross, perhaps, between Royal Ascot and the dealing floor of a futures exchange, a combination of a very socially elite group who already know each other and can interact with each other, and at the same time a group of hardened professionals who have their own language and their own codes, who know how to strike deals and to extract the best possible advantages from a particular situation.
Versailles was the original hotbed of scandal. The phrase with which everyone began their conversation was on dit, it's being said. They're saying this, they're saying that. All day, these whispers of rumour would travel about the palace, and people would send each other little bulletins by sedan chair to report on what was going on in the different rooms. And that, of course, made it a tremendously claustrophobic place to live. You couldn't do anything without everybody knowing about it.
It was this extraordinary networking centre. Everyone who was anyone in France was now at Versailles. So to be excluded was disastrous for a French nobleman.
The worst thing that a courtier could hear from the king was, "He's a man I never see." People would spend literally years trying to hear one word or have a gesture from the king.
With the nobility now so dependent on him, Louis could fully immerse himself in the role he was born to play.
He emerges as this absolutely consummate performer. The whole regime at Versailles hinged on your having this extraordinarily charismatic figure who could perform in all the right ways for this enormous audience which he had assembled around him.
But Louis was only human, and after years of good health, he began to suffer from a serious medical problem, an anal fistula.
Restez encore un peu. Vous souffrez le martyre.
Comme j'aimerais, madame. La France ne veut rien savoir de mes douleurs. Et le roi se doit entièrement à ses sujets.
This was an extremely serious condition in the context of the 17th century. The risk of it becoming gangrenous, that the pus would seep into the rest of the body and infect, was very great indeed. Untreated, it would almost certainly have killed the king. The only way that it was likely to be cured was through invasive surgery. Such surgery had had a very poor success rate.
But Louis instructed his doctors to go ahead. His senior physician devised a new instrument especially for the operation.
The doctors involved in the operation practiced on a number of others who had anal fistulas beforehand, but it was nonetheless still a very risky operation. In the 17th century, the doctors were much more likely to kill you than cure you. Huge effort was made at Versailles to keep the details of this secret because it was felt so likely that the king wouldn't survive, that the diplomatic repercussions of this would sweep through Europe.
Majesté.
Monsieur le chirurgien, traitez-moi comme le moindre de mes sujets. Ainsi, votre main ne tremblera pas.
Bien, Majesté.
He was so stalwart during the operation. He never spoke at all. Imagine the pain. No anesthetic.
This extraordinary self-control he had. He just gritted his teeth and conducted himself with great dignity.
Maintenant, il faut prier pour le salut total du roi.
And that night he took a council meeting. Extraordinary. Very pale, with a sort of sheen of sweat, but he made it.
Louis recovered his health, but other troubles were looming. His fame and success had earned him many enemies. 2 years after his operation, France began a costly war against Spain, England, and Sweden. As the fighting dragged on, some of Versailles' silver was quietly removed and melted down to pay the king's soldiers. Unable to win the war, Louis signed an unfavorable peace treaty, conceding territory to his enemies. The Sun King was finally in decline, and although he continued to make small improvements to his great palace, he lost much of his enthusiasm.
Ces nouveaux travaux sont-ils bien utiles?
L'opéra, sire.
C'est vrai que notre Versailles a beaucoup manqué d'un opéra. Mais il est trop tard, monsieur Mansart. Faites notre nouvelle chambre. Et pour l'opéra, nous laisserons cela à nos successeurs.
After just 4 years of peace, a new crisis threatened. The Spanish king died, leaving his empire to Louis's grandson. If Louis accepted on the boy's behalf, he knew the other European powers would try to stop him. But if he refused, the territories would go to France's rivals in Austria. He was in an impossible situation.
Louis was damned if he did, damned if he didn't. Faced with an issue which concerns the honour of his dynasty, it's perhaps not surprising that he opts for the acceptance of the Spanish offer. But inevitably, therefore, provokes war with the other major European powers.
This, the most grueling war of Louis's reign, lasted for 12 years and brought France to the brink of ruin. As Louis grew old and frail, he fell ever more under the influence of his devout wife, and now shunned the lavish amusements that had once filled his beloved palace.
I think Versailles became a chilly, tedious place in many respects once Mantanong got Louis into her grip. It became this sort of rather dreary world where whatever the King of France was doing, you could set your watch by. You could look at a clock at any hour of the day and know exactly where Louis was. And his whole life became this endless choreography of etiquette and ritual, with Madame de Maintenon sitting there in the corner like some sort of holy spider watching it all.
Notre Versailles est bien mort.
Ces fêtes que vous donniez ne faisaient qu'exacerber les vices de vos courtisans.
Et sire, vous dépensiez sans compter.
Mantanong was a comfort to Louis when he needed it the most. Illness took the life of many members of his family, including a son and grandson, and he was haunted by the legacy of his wars.
I think Louis was a tragic figure in his final days. I think the tragedy began with the sudden deaths of so many of his nearest and dearest. Louis had Mantanong by his side, but she said about him that sometimes he would be alone with her, he'd shut the doors, and then he would just weep about the way things had gone. I think it was a very sad old age, you know, outliving his descendants and having led France into these wars which seemed so wonderful when he was winning them and became so ghastly when he wasn't.
Aged 76, and after 72 years on the throne, Louis was once again taken seriously ill.
On dit que la jambe de Sa Majesté est aussi noire que le charbon.
Hélas.
No one expected Louis XIV to live as long as he did. When Louis finally weakens in the last year of his life, it's a result of a gangrenous infection which gradually spreads from his leg to the rest of the left side of his body.
Even Louis's own death became a public performance.
J'ai vécu parmi les gens de ma cour. Je veux mourir parmi eux. Faites-les entrer pour mon dîner.
In spite of their long intimacy, Mantanong wasn't actually at the king's side when he died, and that was not the practice. By her own wish, she went off to a convent to be among ladies who would succour her and sympathize with her, leaving him to priest and ultimately to God. He died rather slowly, and so she came back once, I think twice, to be with him again, but ultimately it was time for her to go. The heir to the throne was a really tiny child, the little 5-year-old boy, and he's brought in to see his grandfather, and his grandfather sort of tells him to be a good king, but says, "I have loved war too much." Very sad, dying words from Louis XIV, certainly true.
Throughout his long reign, Louis sought to bring glory to himself and his country. That lifelong devotion, expressed in the extraordinary palace he built at Versailles, is the reason he's become part of the very essence of France.
He didn't just leave glorious monuments, beautiful buildings, fabulous paintings. He left a sense of identity which has endured until today.
Louis certainly embodies, I think, the idea of the greatness of France.
He was the king and you were the subject, and there was never any doubt about that.
He imposed his will on the world so splendidly in every respect.
He wanted to impress everybody, and I think he succeeded.
The scale of the vision is breathtaking. No one did it like Louis.
The world's most magnificent palace is about to become its most notorious. Home to decadence on a truly royal scale. Prostitution and gluttony. Gambling and torture. And enough sex to scandalize even the French. This is the story of a king who took Versailles, turned it into his palace of pleasure, and brought the monarchy to the brink of collapse.
Que voulez-vous? Louis le XIVe, que Dieu nous a donné pour roi.
The waking ceremony of the Duke of Anjou, by grace of God, King Louis XV, monarch of France and Navarre. And just an 11-year-old boy.
N'est-ce pas une bien lourde tâche à laquelle je suis appelée?
Souvenez-vous, votre bisaïeul vous a prédit que vous serez le plus grand roi du monde.
Qu'advient-il de celui qui faillit, monseigneur?
Suivez en tout l'exemple du grand roi, Louis XIV. Et vous aurez la même gloire.
Louis will reign for 58 years, but his whole life will be lived in the shadow of another man's glory, his predecessor, Louis XIV.
Louis XIV was an incredibly tough act to follow. He is seen as the great. He's the conqueror of Europe. He adds to France. He's the greatest monarch of the 17th century.
He was the first actor on the stage of Versailles. He was the sun. He was Apollo, the sun god. Everything orbited around him. The etiquette of the court, the day of the court, the extraordinary life lived entirely in the public gaze.
In his patronage of the arts, in his building projects, in his personal conduct, in the way he dressed, the way he ate, the way he looked, the way he walked. From the fountains in his gardens to the silver by his bed. He had established a form of etiquette with the sole view of making the whole country of France entirely focused upon his person and his power.
Louis XV never expected to be king, but both his father and grandfather died before they could reach the throne.
Louis XV loses his parents and his grandparents when he's 2 years old. He's an orphan brought up by people that he doesn't know very well, some of whom are probably fairly terrifying as courtiers. He's a sickly child very early on.
Wherever he went, Louis was surrounded by the legacy of his great-grandfather, the man who first built the extraordinary palace that was his home.
Certainly, one would imagine Louis XV has been traumatized by the death of all his near family and is a lonely and probably slightly disturbed child in his youth. And I think this carries through the rest of his life.
Louis had been called the King of France since he was 5, but others ran the country in his name. On his 12th birthday, it was time for him to take his crown and his place on the world stage.
The coronation of Louis XV was a moment of great hope and expectation for the French people. They had had long years of war, and now the country was at peace, and it had a young king in whom it was possible to invest every conceivable hope. So they could project their ambitions and expectations for the new reign on this young, as yet untested king.
But there was a shadow over Louis's inheritance, cast not by an eclipse, but by a mountain of debt. Despite all his success in war and diplomacy, Louis XIV never managed to balance the books, or even pay for the building of his enormous palace.
On a craint pendant longtemps que la nuit qui nous entoure reste là à jamais. Mais dans quelques 2 minutes, sire, vous allez voir le soleil réapparaître. Et ce sera comme si rien ne s'était passé.
Louis XIV, when he died, left France in absolutely dire straits. After a long war, he of course left France something like 20 years' revenue in debt, 2 billion livres in debt at least. And this was going to be an absolutely massive problem.
2 billion livres. That's 160 billion pounds in today's money. But before he could start work on that problem, there was one other thing that demanded the new king's immediate attention: marriage.
Louis XV was more than ready to get married. When he was 15, his original fiancée, who was the little Infanta of Spain, was still only 5 years old. And since 15-year-old boys loathe sweet little girls, he was rather embarrassed to have her around the place. Also, the ministers were terribly keen to get him breeding, so the little Infanta and her dolls were packed off back to Madrid, and a new wife had to be found. They cast about for princesses, and they eventually settled on Maria Lesinskaya, who wasn't the most obvious choice, since her father was the deposed King of Poland, and she really had no money. She was 22, quite pretty, although, as the female courtiers disparagingly remarked, her complexion had never known any other cosmetic than snow. Nonetheless, 15-year-old boys aren't really very choosy, and Louis fell madly in love with her at once.
La reine plaît infiniment à Sa Majesté. Notre roi l'a honorée 7 fois.
Royal sex lives were public property, and Louis was much discussed in the corridors of Versailles, if not always believed.
7 sacrements pour la première nuit, je n'en crois rien du tout. D'ailleurs, les rois trompent toujours leur peuple.
Vous voyez, une ingénue peut parfois tromper son monde.
Le roi!
Louis was now a husband, but he had yet to truly become a ruler. So he set out to copy his great-grandfather. Louis XIV had begun his reign by becoming his own prime minister. So now, number 15 decided to do exactly the same.
It would have been very simple for Louis XV to choose a prime minister, which would have been a much better solution for him, because he could have then had someone picked and appointed for the job.
Il est temps que je prenne moi-même le gouvernement de mon État et que je me donne tout entier à l'amour que je dois à mes peuples. Aussi, ai-je jugé nécessaire de supprimer et d'éteindre les fonctions de Premier ministre. Je veux suivre en tout l'exemple de Feu le Roi, mon bisaïeul.
He's got this sense of he has to follow in the footsteps of his great-grandfather, Louis XIV, and to be a real king, he has to be a new Louis XIV.
Louis was living just like his great-grandfather, ruling as an absolute monarch, enjoying the hunting in the forests around Versailles, and soon fulfilling the first and most important of all his royal roles, fathering an heir.
Mon fils! Un fils. Mon fils, mon roi.
La Vierge que j'ai priée à Notre-Dame et à Sainte-Geneviève.
The relationship between Louis XV and his wife, Maria Leszczyńska, started very well, really.
Un dauphin.
They managed to put together a relationship which, over a period of 10 years, certainly, was quite a happy one. They had a string of children, and they seemed to have found a certain, sort of emotional support in each other's company.
Maître Corbeau sur un arbre perché.
More children followed at regular intervals over the next 10 happy years. 8 girls and 2 boys.
Mes petites amours, mes petites torches, faites un baiser à votre père, là, sur la joue.
Louis may have enjoyed being a father, but the Queen, after a decade of non-stop pregnancies, was fed up with it all.
The Queen began to complain that she was either pregnant, in bed, or being brought to bed. Eventually, they had 10 children by the time Louis himself was 27. The Queen had really had enough, so she began to tell the king that he wasn't allowed to come into her bedroom on certain saints' days because she was a very pious woman. Gradually, the saints' days got more frequent and the saints themselves became increasingly obscure, until finally Louis lost his temper and asked Lebel, who was the concierge of Versailles, to bring him a woman, any woman.
Louis only had to ask, and just about anything and anyone could be provided. And was.
The king gradually got into the habit of first having dalliances with the court ladies and then full-blown affairs.
Vous savez que j'ai une sœur, Louis?
Louis began a life of carnal adventures that would turn him into one of history's greatest libertines.
He was a great womanizer, but there was nothing unusual about that. French kings were expected to be womanizers. This was seen as a sign that they were virile and were going to produce an heir and were in fact acting in an aristocratic and masculine way. Indeed, within the aristocratic society that the king had been raised, the idea of marital fidelity was seen as laughable.
Louis's first illicit amour was Louise Julie de Nesle, a beautiful young aristocrat and the eldest of 5 equally attractive sisters.
Eh bien, ma sœur m'assaille de lettres depuis quelques mois, et elle ne rêve que d'une chose, me dit-elle, être ici, à Versailles, qu'elle appelle son Eldorado.
What was interesting was that he then proceeded to take all the other sisters in her family as his mistresses too. And although it's slightly doubtful that he had an affair with the 4th, it's probable that he did.
Et qu'elle aimerait se coucher. Elle est juste à côté.
Eh bien, faites-la entrer.
Ma sœur?
Il ne faudrait pas que proche du roi, elle n'y gagne qu'un vilain refroidissement.
It was rumoured that one of the sisters, the Duchesse de Châteauroux, would ask her other sister to come along and give matters a helping hand occasionally.
Viens, ne prends pas froid.
In some senses, it was a scandal, but I think people thought it was funny rather than disgraceful. Both Louis XIV and Louis XV had huge sexual appetites, and perhaps 4 women were really what the Bourbon blood needed.
Louis's affairs with his favourite sisters and his simultaneous flings with many other women produced the inevitable consequences.
In the course of his reign, the king would father a whole brood of illegitimate children. We're not actually sure how many, but certainly in the region of 30, I think, would be a decent guess.
But as the rooms of Versailles filled up with Louis's offspring, the king's mind moved to affairs of state. He'd decided to copy his illustrious predecessor in another way, by taking France to war.
The decision of Louis XV to go to war in 1744 was hugely popular. This is what a king of France should do. He should be seen at the head of his armies, fighting and leading his troops.
Louis's declaration of war against France's traditional enemies, of Britain and Austria, made him a hero on the streets. And so did his decision to lead his armies in person, accompanied, of course, by 2 of the de Nesle sisters. But war was to bring Louis his first brush with death.
While he was at Metz, he fell terribly ill, and it was considered that he was going to die.
Certainly the doctors had given up hope, and back in France, the population was shocked, genuinely, absolutely frozen with fear that they would lose their king.
L'état de Sa Majesté a empiré.
Tout est perdu.
In order, as a Catholic, to receive the last sacraments, he had to confess. And in order to confess, he had to send away his mistress and renounce her.
Louis didn't think much of his marriage vows, but like most people of his age, he did believe in heaven and hell. And he knew which one he wanted to avoid.
La Sainte Église ne peut donner les sacrements à votre Majesté, dès lors que sa maîtresse est à ses côtés.
The king, like the least of his subjects, was afraid of dying without absolution and was afraid for the state of his immortal soul.
Sauvez mon âme, Monseigneur.
He knew that one day he would have to face God and give an account of himself, and then he would just be a man before God, like any other man.
Il vous faut quitter cette ville immédiatement, madame, et n'y plus jamais paraître.
N'y a-t-il plus aucun espoir?
C'est le prix du salut de mon âme.
The mistresses were sent away, but they refused to go completely. They hung around in the town of Metz until the bishops were obliged to send a message saying that our Lord wasn't really going to wait upon their pleasure, and would they please get out.
And so the Donnell sisters was dispatched. The king promised that if he was saved, he would dedicate the rest of his life to the well-being of religion and his subjects.
Avec le secours de votre sainte grâce, je vous demande pardon pour mes fautes.
The king received the last rites, but then, miraculously, recovered. And it's from this period that his name, Bien-Aimé, the well-beloved, dates, because the people were so pleased that their young king had recovered from his illness.
Sa Majesté me charge de vous dire qu'elle se repent du mal qu'elle a pu commettre et promet de consacrer le reste de ses heures au bien de ses sujets.
But Louis's newfound piety didn't last long.
As soon as he possibly could, he went back to his old ways.
And within a few months, Madame de Châteauroux was back in his bed.
Louis the Beloved became even more popular in 1745. He was present on the battlefield as the French army crushed the Austrians and the British at the Battle of Fontenoy. France was the dominant power in Europe once again, just as she had been in the time of Louis XIV. It was the perfect moment for Louis to meet the love of his life.
He's out hunting in the forest outside Versailles, and he comes across in her carriage this very beautiful, very striking young woman. Everyone knows he's taken by her. People refer to her as Louis XV's latest piece of game.
She was called Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, the future Marquise de Pompadour. And she was much more than a piece of game.
In fact, Madame de Pompadour is a rather well-connected woman with one of the key factions at the heart of power, who form part of a big financial clique. What everyone says, she's strikingly beautiful. And her beauty is really the key to her initial success. She uses her beauty, she uses her very considerable political acumen to establish herself at the heart of the king's power.
Monsieur le Duc, les vieux raisonnements moraux sur l'infériorité féminine, la tendresse de son tempérament et sa faiblesse intime sont à oublier. Selon messieurs Diderot et d'Alembert, la femme est l'égale de l'homme.
Vous écoutant, madame, il me serait difficile de ne pas en convenir. De grâce.
She was nicknamed Renette, the little queen, as a child, because when she was 8, she had gone to see a fortune teller who had told her that the King of France would fall in love with her. So she and her family were absolutely convinced that this was her destiny.
Demandez à un crapaud ce qu'est la beauté. Il vous répondra avec mon ami Voltaire.
She sang, she danced, she had a beautiful voice, she was very well read, marvelous conversationist, extremely charming woman.
Très spirituelle. Très spirituelle.
Que l'on serve encore à notre chère marquise de ce vin du diable qui délie si bien les langues. Si.
Louis XV and Madame de Pompadour were really very much in love. And at first, in fact, for some years, their relationship was sexually passionate. He found her very desirable. Not so much, I think, because she was as sexy as the Donnell sisters had been, but because she understood him very well. She knew how to amuse him, to captivate him, to charm him, to divert him.
simple.
Mais la pudeur, Louis.
Ève était nue jusqu'à l'invention de la honte.
Soit. Mais fermez les yeux.
Certainement pas.
She was a very emotionally intelligent woman, Madame de Pompadour, and I think it was this that Louis loved in her. Unfortunately, she herself said that she was physically a cold woman. She didn't really derive any pleasure from lovemaking. She didn't have the temperament for it. But she tried very hard. She put herself on all these sorts of ridiculous diets of, egg yolks and red wine with gold flakes sprinkled it to try and build herself up and increase the heat of her temperament in order to satisfy Louis in bed. But her maid, Madame d'Orsay, pointed out that she would kill herself rather than please Louis by doing this, and so she gave it up.
Tiens, voici l'abbé, le confesseur des jolies femmes.
Madame Pompadour may have been a favourite with her lover, the king, but most other inhabitants of Versailles were not impressed with her.
On dit qu'un certain roi a 500 bouffons qui l'accompagnent partout pour le faire rire.
The courtiers loathed Madame de Pompadour because she was bourgeoise. They could not forgive her for being middle class. It was just about acceptable for a king to have liaisons with lower class prostitutes, but a maîtresse en titre had always been an aristocratic woman.
Ignoring the snobs at court, Pompadour used all her charm and intelligence to advance the interest of her small group of friends and do down her rivals.
She was associated with a cabal at court who were constantly trying to promote the interests of such and such a general. So she had a kind of a political baggage that she carried.
Elle se fait acheter des châteaux, partout aussi. Projette d'en acheter d'autres encore et vous allez me dire que c'est aussi...
Children are rarely keen on their father's new girlfriend, and the same was true at Versailles, especially when Louis's many children saw him spending a fortune on her.
Qui lui a tiré la langue, c'est bien vous.
Je hais Madame de Pompadour autant que vous.
They felt, rightly or wrongly, that her presence somehow demeaned their father.
Elle déshonore le roi, je le lui ai assez dit.
As a consequence, of course, they famously dubbed her
Madame Putain.
Mummy Whore.
Louis's children may have loathed her, but their mother, the Queen, was rather impressed.
She was particularly nice to the Queen, which poor old Maria Lesinskaya was very grateful for, because until Madame de Pompadour arrived, nobody had ever taken any notice of her at all. In fact, the first time she was ever sent flowers was at Madame de Pompadour's instigation. And although obviously the difference in their positions meant that they could never be anything like friends, the Queen was heard to say, if there must be a mistress, better that it is this one.
Louis was victorious in war and lucky in love, and it made him grow overconfident. In a grand personal gesture, he agreed to a peace deal with Austria, one that handed back most of the territory his generals had just won for him. His ministers thought it was a terrible idea and told him so.
Ça leur a coûté cher. Ils ont payé sans rechigner les impôts que la guerre imposait. Ne croyez-vous pas qu'il serait juste de leur donner une explication?
Des explications? Des explications. Le roi doit-il s'expliquer?
The peace is not a very good peace for France, because France gets absolutely nothing for it except enormous debts from its participation in the war.
The French public, having dispensed millions of livres and lost countless men dead, could not understand why their king was giving up his conquests. As a result, school children and fishwives were said to be running around in Paris with the line, "You're as stupid as the peace."
Just as Louis's popularity began to wane, his love affair with Madame Pompadour was also drawing to a close. His solution was a private harem in the town of Versailles, known as the Deer Park.
When Louis XV and Madame de Pompadour ceased to have a sexual relationship, Louis XV didn't really want to replace her with another mistress. They got on too well for that. And from now on, his sexual appetite was catered for by a series of young women who were brought out from Paris, teenage nymphets, uneducated. Often they had no idea who their powerful lover was.
young, virginal, beautiful girls are brought in for his sexual gratification. But this is developed into something altogether more salacious by the press at this time.
When things had been going well, Louis was forgiven, even praised, for indulging his royal lust. But after his hated peace treaty, people saw their king's behavior very differently.
There's a sort of gutter press, effectively, which just amplifies this, makes him an absolute sexual debauchee of the worst imaginable kind.
The Deer Park obviously did create rumours at the time. It was, according to them, the scene of these terrible orgies in which underage girls would be shipped in droves from Paris for wicked Louis XV to enjoy. And one of the worst things that was said was that Madame de Pompadour acted as a sort of procuress, that she would find the girls for Louis and entice them to the Deer Park. It couldn't have been less true. Madame de Pompadour knew about it and she accepted it as a necessity.
Et vous, madame? Qu'en pensez-vous?
Faced with a deluge of criticism, Louis turned to the one person he could trust completely.
Pas de grand coucher ce soir. Je n'en peux plus.
Il le faut bien pourtant.
Ironically, the influence of Madame de Pompadour actually increases as she stops sharing the king's bed. She grew more important to him because she was his friend. She was one of the few people, almost the only person, that he could actually trust at court. You have to remember that the court is a place of intrigue and masks and pretense, and nobody tells the truth to the king. So he really needed her. He needed her in his life as his friend.
As the top power broker in Versailles, Pompadour was drawn more and more into the business of government.
Madame de Pompadour's excursion into politics is not something that would make a feminist proud. She was a clever woman, but she really didn't understand politics.
Pour la Lorraine, n'ayez pas d'inquiétude. Dès que le père de notre reine sera décédé, elle sera définitivement...
Louis very foolishly entrusted her as a go-between with the Austrian ambassador. And Madame de Pompadour was so proud of herself, being given this important role. She took it terribly seriously, was very excited, and she was completely manipulated by the ambassador.
Et pour ce qui fut l'objet de notre dernier entretien...
J'y travaille, mon cher ami. Et je travaille le roi en ce sens.
Louis's peace with Austria was unpopular, but his decision to allow Madame Pompadour to secure an actual alliance with the old enemy was downright detested.
Madame de Pompadour certainly is in favour of an alliance with Austria. So it's an absolute shock to courtiers, many of whom have long-term loyalties and no doubt family connections, to find that France is now allied with a traditional enemy.
Criticism of Louis and Pompadour became even more lurid, and it reached every corner of Versailles.
They would accuse her of sexual diseases. They would accuse her of procuring young girls for the king. They would say anything they wanted. There were secret pamphlets, secret poems, extremely rude poems about her physique and her body. Poems would be left in Versailles by court officials, perhaps even members of his family.
J'annonce à votre majesté de la part de Dieu qu'il faut absolument renvoyer Madame de Pompadour au plus tôt. Autrement, sa main vengeresse va s'étendre sur votre royaume et punir vos sujets de la faiblesse de leur souverain.
Some of the secret notes even threatened the king with death.
One of the most famous of these contained the phrase, "Wake up, or stir yourselves, the sons of Ravaillac," which was a direct reference to the man who had assassinated Henry IV in 1610. And so for the first time we start to see references in these pamphlets to calls for the killing of the king.
Que dit-on de moi?
On dit du roi qu'il est endormi dans la volupté, que le nombre de ses maîtresses lui dissimule la vue de ses peuples, que vos courtisans sont corrompus et que vos ministres sont méchants et imbéciles.
Il y a pire encore. Quand je vois vos tristes figures, je le sais.
Il se colporte que le roi a la peste. Et que pour s'en guérir, il prend des bains de sang d'enfant qu'il fait enlever.
In 1750, there's the extraordinary episode where there is a rumour and there are riots that Louis XV is having his police force kidnap children so that he can cure himself of some horrible illness by bathing in the blood of these kidnapped Parisian children. So this is a very serious and very shocking state of affairs.
Les choses comme elles sont dureront bien autant que moi. Réveillez-vous, man de Ravaillac.
Louis's one-man diplomacy was supposed to bring peace to Europe, but instead, in 1756, he joined his new ally, Austria, in a war against Britain and Prussia. It started well, but messengers were soon arriving at Versailles with bad news from the front.
As the tide of war changed against the French, the Parisian public actually got into the habit of dancing in the streets to celebrate their defeats, and by doing so, showing how much they detested that Austrian alliance.
The war was not going well for Louis or for France, and public frustration with the king took a dangerous turn.
In January 1757, Louis XV is going to his carriage, going down the steps, and a certain individual called Damien rushes up. And then he feels blood, and he says, "I've been hit, that's the man that did it."
Monsieur le Dauphin! Qu'on arrête cet homme. Mais qu'on ne lui fasse aucun mal.
Damien is immediately arrested, tortured on his feet by the Chancellor, although Louis XV did not want him to be tortured, to see whether he had any accomplices and whether the knife was in fact a poisoned knife, which is the great fear that they have at the time.
Mais si j'avais voulu le tuer, j'en étais le maître! J'ai voulu que l'avertir. Ma lame n'était pas empoisonnée.
As far as we can see, he seems to be a nobody. He's a Lee Harvey Oswald figure, if you like. But what makes people suspicious is that he's a nobody connected to some quite important somebodies. He's worked as a servant for a number of members of the Paris Parliament. People never quite are certain whether he is not part of a sort of wave of hostility towards Louis XV.
Louis took this amateurish attempt on his life very badly. Although his doctors promised a full recovery, he was convinced this was the end of him.
Je vous laisse un royaume bien troublé. Je vous souhaite que vous le gouverniez mieux que moi.
It's a flesh wound, the mildest of cuts, effectively, but it has a disproportionate effect on Louis XV. He goes into a very deep depression after this because he feels that, you know, he has become, instead of the well-beloved, he's become the well-hated.
Je meurs.
Vos médecins, Louis, disent qu'il n'y a point à s'inquiéter.
Je meurs et je le sais bien. Que l'on fasse venir l'abbé Rochecourt pour qu'il me donne l'absolution.
Vous en connaissez le prix, Louis.
Je vais paraître au tribunal de Dieu, madame.
Rather amusingly, an old marshal comes along and asks him to cough, spit and piss, and he says, "Well, you're okay. Okay, my lad. There's nothing important being touched." But that's not, of course, the way Louis XV sees it.
Alors, la blessure est peu profonde, tout juste la pointe d'un ongle. Bien, très bien.
Elle est plus que vous croyez, car elle va jusqu'au cœur.
The psychological shock of one of his own subjects attacking him. This situation is the culmination of his lack of virtue, and so he's bound to feel that it's his own fault, he's bound to feel guilty, and it's bound to give rise to a great deal of self-questioning.
Hearing the grim details of the punishment planned for his would-be assassin did nothing to improve Louis's mood.
Mené et conduit dans le dit tombeau à la place de grève. Et sur un échafaud qui sera dressé, tenaillé aux mamelles, bras, cuisses et gras de jambes.
He's going to pay for this very, very dearly, in that he's not merely going to be executed. He's going to be put to death in the most horrible way that can be devised by judicial cruelty.
Sa main droite tenant en micelle le couteau dont il a commis le dit parricide, brûlé de feu de soufre.
He's executed in the most extraordinarily gory way on the Place de Grève in Paris, sort of strapped down to the wheel, and the executioner goes around breaking most bones in his body with an iron bar.
He is burnt with tongs, and his flesh is knowingly pulled away from his body.
And it goes on and on and on. But at the end of it, 4 horses are attached to each of his limbs, and they're encouraged to sort of, gallop off in different directions, pulling his body to pieces. Well, they do that, and it's not working, so the executioner goes back and he starts hacking at various pieces, so effectively he can be pulled to pieces. Damien stays alive and conscious for much of this operation.
He finally dies after 4 hours of absolute torment, which is going to disgust people by its reports.
Assez. Taisez-vous.
Louis had had nothing to do with the grisly execution, but accounts of it stained his reputation right across Europe.
It gives the reign of Louis XV this incredibly ghastly, sort of backward sort of feeling to it.
Although his physical suffering was nothing compared to that meted out to Damien, Louis's mental stability was badly shaken by the affair. His closest aides described him as troubled and depressed.
For a monarch who takes being a king extremely seriously, this is a big thing. And all the court talk about over the next couple of years is this depression, this sort of melancholic vein to Louis XV.
Seigneur, je crie vers vous du fond de l'abîme, que mes cris parviennent jusqu'à vous.
To make matters worse, the conflict with Britain was proving to be disastrous. By the end of what's called the 7 Years' War, the French were driven out of Canada, India, and much of the Caribbean.
The British, largely because of their navy, were able completely to turn the tables on France. France has really lost all her pretensions to becoming a global superpower, and she's lost that to England, basically.
If the world is speaking English today, it is partly because of the outcome of the 7 Years' War in the 18th century. It was a disaster for France, it was a disaster for the French monarchy.
For a king whose greatest hope was to live up to the glory of his predecessor, this was almost too much to bear.
Vous connaissez mon amour et mon respect, mais ne me sera-t-il jamais permis de rien faire sans qu'on vous rappelle à moi?
The main thing that a king of France was supposed to do, which is sometimes forgotten, le métier du roi, was the conduct of foreign policy. Now, he wasn't really supposed to mess around with things like the parliament, internal politics. That wasn't his job, it was foreign policy. And if you can't even get that right, you're going to be hated.
Badly shaken by the assassination attempt and widely blamed for each fresh military disaster, Louis hid himself away at Versailles.
The 7 Years' War was undoubtedly the nadir for Louis XV. He withdrew into himself, and instead of doing what he'd done during the Austrian War, of getting to the front and leading his troops, instead he spent his time hunting. And if he wasn't hunting, he was with the girls in the deer park.
Louis may have lost a war, but he was still the absolute ruler of France. And when the criticism of him became too much to bear, he came up with a suitably absolutist response. Even the first encyclopedia in the French language, one of the great intellectual achievements of the age, went onto the bonfire.
Unfortunately, Louis XV was by nature suspicious of anything that he saw as unorthodox, and as a consequence, he just didn't associate himself with this great outpouring of French culture and knowledge.
Louis was still close to Madame Pompadour, who tried to change his mind.
At a dinner party one evening in Versailles, a duke said, "What is gunpowder made of?" And Madame de Pompadour seized the moment and said, "It's true, we don't know what gunpowder is. What a pity it is that your Majesty in his wisdom, you've banned the encyclopedia. Otherwise we could have looked in the encyclopedia and found out what gunpowder is constituted from." So they sent for a copy of the banned encyclopedia, which of course the king had in his private library, and they spent the rest of the evening reading articles in the encyclopedia, and he was of course very intrigued by this, and this was supposed to be one of the reasons why he had it reinstated.
Getting Louis to rescind the ban on the encyclopedia was to be one of Madame Pompadour's last contributions to his life. In 1764, she contracted tuberculosis.
Ce n'est rien, Louis, j'ai consulté vos médecins. Il n'y a rien qui doit vous alarmer.
She's shifted out of Versailles, and courtiers record that, I think, as he's seeing the carriage taking her out of Versailles, he weeps a tear. So he is upset, undoubtedly, by it.
He stood on the balcony and he cried because he had lost the person he trusted the most in the world, and he felt very alone without her.
Her death in 1764 is followed by the death of his son, the Dauphin, in 1765, and a couple of years later, in 1768, the death of his queen, Marie Leczinska. So this is the removal of some very important people in his life. The deaths of these people who are close to him in the mid-1760s undoubtedly has a very big impact on him emotionally.
The death of his closest confidant began the worst period of Louis's life. He spent days lost in introspection or deep in discussion with philosophers and astronomers.
Croyez-vous que quelque part au-delà de cette voûte étoilée dont la vue nous enchante, puisse se trouver le séjour des êtres qui nous ont été chers?
Le paradis, voulez-vous dire, si?
Le paradis céleste, oui.
Je ne peux vous répondre qu'en savant, sire.
Parlez sans censure, monsieur.
You can see that he did have a clear tendency towards some sort of depression. For the rest of his life, he remains withdrawn, somewhat depressive, and obsessed with death.
Lorsqu'il plaira à Dieu de vous rappeler à lui, sire, ce sera pour vous ouvrir les portes de son paradis.
Le paradis. Comme il nous plaît d'espérer le paradis.
Just as his courtiers were almost giving up hope for Louis, he recovered his lust for life. The reason was a new mistress, nearly 40 years younger than him.
I'm rather fond of Madame du Barry. She was as beautiful as an angel and as stupid as a basket, but she made Louis very happy. She was utterly, utterly gorgeous. I mean, all the king's mistresses were always described as ravishing, but I think she was the one who truly was. She was fabulously sexy. She was, I suppose, the sort of 18th century version of the tart with a heart.
Prenez garde à l'assassine, Louis.
Madame du Barry had an instant effect on the aging king. He could think of nothing else but her. She was extremely beautiful. She was supposed to look like a kind of debauched angel.
La friponne est pour vous, sire.
Not too bright, but very good fun.
Mais sauriez-vous trouver la caressante?
Madame du Barry sort of gives him a bit of a perk up, really.
Madame du Barry has an enormous effect upon Louis XV. He's a man of 60 at this point, and she has been a kept woman. I wouldn't necessarily say she's been a prostitute, but she certainly learned a thing or two in the long periods that she spent with a certain number of particular individuals.
Badine.
And I think Louis XV is delighted with the various tricks that she's learned to keep him young, and so it is very good for his mental health, we might say.
Madame du Barry may have perked up the aging Louis, but that did not make her, or him, any more popular.
She was absolutely loathed. Everyone hated her. The Parisians hated her because she wasn't an aristocrat. The aristocrats hated her because she was really little better than a streetwalker. But the king adored her, and he made her very happy.
Louis XV went far too far, and he was seen really as slumming it. It was beneath the dignity of a king to have these sorts of liaisons.
There is no doubt that Louis XV was somebody who was seen as becoming increasingly dissolute, even degenerate, and who was just failing to live up to the standards expected of a man who was king.
Whatever people said about him, the new relationship gave Louis the confidence to embark on a grand project. To give his new heir, the future Louis XVI, the greatest wedding of the century. The young Louis was due to marry Marie Antoinette of Austria, and Louis wanted the ceremony to take place in a brand new theatre inside Versailles, a project abandoned years before by Louis XIV.
Par le moyen des 60 criques se trouvant sous ce plancher, sire, celui-ci sera remonté à même hauteur que la scène.
Votre table de 22 couverts, sire, à laquelle prendra place la famille royale, sera sur la scène. Elle sera démontée dès la fin du souper pour laisser place à l'orchestre.
Louis XV felt the crown was under threat from the Parlement, from different sections of society. It had suffered the defeats of the 7 Years' War. Therefore, he wanted a spectacular royal wedding to assert the splendor and power of the monarchy.
Comme vous pouvez le voir, sire, l'avancée de votre loge au-dessus de la salle a été supprimée.
Et c'est fort bien comme cela.
The politicians grumbled about the crippling cost of the royal wedding, but Louis just kept on spending.
Cela durera tant que vous n'aurez pas fait taire les parlements, sire. Aujourd'hui, ils parlent de liberté, mais s'ils venaient à devenir les maîtres, ils exerceraient sur les esprits, les discours, les mœurs, l'inquisition la plus violente.
Parliament becomes an endless thorn in the side of the crown. Sometimes the king is conciliatory towards them, at other times he's very repressive against them. But in 1770, he decides to tackle the problem in a different way. He basically tries to abolish the Parlement.
Louis's decision to remove the one organization in France that could challenge him for authority was a flagrant abuse of royal power.
De funestes exemples montrent hélas qu'un royaume, quelque ancien et important qu'il soit, peut sombrer dès lors que l'anarchie s'y est substituée au pouvoir royal. C'est pourquoi nous sommes résolus de briser les parlements et de reprendre la maîtrise des affaires de l'État.
Sire.
Silence!
So this is a coup d'etat in the sense that one of the things that is absolutely key for the self-image of the French monarchy is that it is a legitimate absolute monarchy that rules according to the laws. So to abolish the law courts themselves is a very powerful signal and a very blatant act of royal despotism.
Si notre autorité est sans cesse contestée, si chacune de nos décisions est remise en cause, alors tout progrès est impossible.
Louis believed he was acting in the best interests of France, whose outdated legal system stood in the way of progress.
Il est intolérable que la défense des privilèges de quelques-uns s'oppose à des réformes nécessaires au pays tout entier.
So he introduced wholesale reforms, for example, free justice. Also, the judges themselves were now to be appointed by the Crown for life, and they would no longer buy their position as judge, as had been the case before. So for many, including Voltaire, this was seen as an enlightened reform. Unfortunately for Louis XV, by silencing the Parlement, the king unleashed opposition on a scale that had not been seen for generations.
It was too late for Louis to play the reformer. Years of erotic self-indulgence, along with failed wars and bungled diplomacy, had cemented his subjects' opinion of him. A bad king and a bad man.
Louis XV, towards the end of his reign, is sunk in vice, and the people of Paris and the courtiers are all very well aware that he has somehow taken the path of personal pleasure and not been a very successful king. His reforms are falling flat. He's got a mistress who is frankly not of courtly rank, and he's simply not kingly. On top of it all, on Easter Sunday, 1774, the Abbé Beauvais, the most eloquent sermonizer at the court of Louis XV, makes this devastating sermon.
Tels ces vieillards vicieux qui conservent encore dans les glaces de l'âge les feux impurs de la concupiscence, finit par chercher de nouveaux plaisirs dans les vils restes de la licence publique.
This is really scandalous. It is such a direct attack on the morality of the king that's never been witnessed at court.
Sire, mon devoir de ministre d'un Dieu de vérité m'ordonne de vous dire que vos peuples sont malheureux, que vous en êtes la cause, et qu'on vous le laisse ignorer.
Louis XV himself must be intensely mortified by the fact that he is not loved, that he faces opposition at court, and for the fact that he is so isolated within his own courtly environment.
If the Abbé intended to wound Louis, he could not have expected what happened next.
Weeks after this humiliating dressing down by the Abbé Beauvais at Easter, Louis XV falls ill. Nobody knows what's wrong with him. And it takes the doctors gathered around him several days to work out what's going on. They bleed him, which can only weaken him, to my mind. And then suddenly one of the doctors sees familiar blotches and they realize that he has smallpox.
It is a complete bolt out of the blue. Smallpox in the 18th century is still an absolute killer disease.
De la lumière, qu'on approche de la lumière.
He had a particularly unpleasant form of it, which was the black variety that changed the entire colour of the face to a sort of dark copper mask.
Elle en aura fait des ravages.
And so he was completely disfigured.
Even as he approached death, Louis's enemies spread stories about his sex life.
It was suggested that he may have caught his smallpox from a prostitute, but the whole idea of a corrupt body, of a corrupt king, was very resonant. And it was thought that this was a fitting punishment, the outward and visible sign of an inward, invisible damnation.
It riddles his body and it produces a horrible stench as his inner organs start decaying.
On dit que la tête de Sa Majesté est aussi noire que celle des habitants de la lointaine Afrique.
Noire comme le fond de son âme. Pour son âme, soyez assurés que Sa Majesté en demandera l'absolution avant qu'il soit trop tard.
Noire comme son cœur, alors.
Underneath it all, he is very devout, and he goes into ultra-devout mode. He sends away Madame du Barry from the court in the same way that he sent away the Duchesse de Châteauroux in 1744 at Metz.
Sa Majesté ne veut pas recommencer le scandale de Metz.
Once she had left, it was possible for him to receive the last rites of the church. And in his final hours, he made a great effort, I think, to die as a Christian.
Messieurs, le roi m'a chargé de vous dire qu'il demandait pardon à Dieu de l'avoir offensé et du scandale qu'il a donné à son peuple. Que si Dieu lui rend la santé, il s'occupera de faire pénitence, du soutien et du soulagement de ses peuples.
J'aurais aimé avoir la force de le dire moi-même.
In fact, he did face it the last few days with considerable courage.
He goes about dying like a good Christian, like a good king. Dying, in fact, like Louis XIV.
When the announcement came, no one seemed to care.
Le roi est mort!
When he actually dies, you can hear a stampede, almost the thunder of running feet as everybody abandons the antechamber where he's lying.
The death of every king, you have to have an autopsy, and the king's physician offers this to the ceremonial officers, and they don't want to know at all. They turn their back and run rather fast, clutching their noses as they do so, and the king is sealed into an iron coffin.
Once the news of his death was known, there was great celebration. There was a general sense of relief that the man who had once been Louis the Well-Beloved had gone. The population had just lost any hope or confidence in their king, and indeed I think it's fair to say they'd fallen out of love with their king.
It has been argued that the monarchy could never recover from the harm engendered by Louis XV. He had dragged it into such disrepute that there was no recovery.
The abiding memory of Louis XV is a man who is morally corrupt and is unable to rise above his melancholy to any kind of grandeur. He is the least grand of the French monarchs, surely.
For over a century, the Palace of Versailles was home to the most powerful family in Europe. A place of artistic brilliance, lavish entertainment, passionate love affairs, and outrageous scandals. But while a lucky few danced, feasted, and flirted their days away, the state was on the brink of collapse. Outside these gilded gates, millions of ordinary people were taxed to the hilt, while rich nobles paid virtually nothing. A new king, Louis XVI, and his beautiful young queen, Marie Antoinette, faced the biggest challenge in the history of their illustrious family. Bring fairness to the system and hope to their subjects, or face losing their palace, their crowns, and their heads. In 1775, Versailles celebrated the coronation of a new king and queen. Louis XVI had lived most of his 20 years here, surrounded by courtiers and power brokers. But like his young Austrian wife, Marie Antoinette, he didn't feel ready to rule.
Dieu m'est témoin que je n'ai pas voulu cela.
Seigneur, protégez-nous. Nous régnons si jeunes.
Despite their king's private feelings, the public had high hopes.
He's young, he has a beautiful wife, so there's everything to expect from this new and hopefully glorious reign of Louis XVI.
Louis XVI wants to rule in the grand manner. He wants to be an absolute monarch. He wants to live up to the style of Louis the Great, Louis XIV. But interestingly, he wants also to rule in a way which is popular.
To be truly popular, Louis knew that he had to govern in the interest of all his people, and not just the ones he had grown up with.
Sire, le projet de réaménagement complet de l'Hôtel-Dieu, ainsi que celui de la création d'un nouvel hôpital.
Je contribuerai sur mes fonds propres. Et tous ceux qui n'ont pas une pierre à la place du cœur contribueront aussi. Nous voulons voir ces travaux se
In keeping with the Enlightenment, he's going to be a slightly more modern king. He has ambitions to be a just and a philanthropic monarch. He calls himself Louis the Bienfaisant, Louis the Philanthropic.
In fact, one of his first decisions was so modern that it quite terrified his courtiers.
Sire, renoncez, je vous en supplie une dernière fois.
Ne me dois-je pas de donner l'exemple?
Pas s'il y va de votre vie.
He had his whole family inoculated against smallpox, using a procedure that was experimental and very dangerous.
That was something which, you know, raised hairs at the time. People thought, oh, what will happen if he dies? And I think in that way, the king took the lead. He showed that he could lead with the times and move with the times. And that was a promising start to the reign.
Louis and Marie Antoinette seemed happy and relaxed in public. But behind the smiles, there was a problem with the royal marriage. A big one.
The marriage was, in one way, a disaster. If you say that the point of the marriage was to produce heirs who would combine the blood of the Austrian royal family and the French royal family, well, that wasn't going to happen, because poor Louis XVI simply couldn't, wouldn't, or didn't try to consummate the marriage.
A king and queen's sex life, or lack of one, was an important matter of state. So it didn't take long for news of Louis's failings in the bedchamber to spread around Versailles.
It's so embarrassing, a situation where all the courtiers hung about the bridal chamber. I mean, it's inconceivable to us that they were allowed to do that, and sort of more or less said, "How was it for you, sir?" And nothing happened, and he didn't consummate it for a long time.
Precisely what was going on behind the bedroom door mystified the courtiers and divides historians to this day.
For the first 7 years of the marriage, there is clearly a sexual problem. And certainly that either the couple do not have sex, or they don't have sufficient sex, or they're not sufficiently instructed in sexual matters to actually produce pregnancies and children.
Given the legendary sexual exploits of Louis XIV and XV, it's hard to believe that number 16 was such a blushing innocent.
It does seem extraordinary that he wouldn't have known how to do it, but apparently he didn't.
But some believe it wasn't ignorance that stopped Louis from doing his royal duty, it was illness. A rare medical condition called phimosis, which meant that lovemaking was more pain than pleasure.
It's possible that Louis XVI had a malformation which needed to be corrected by minor surgery before he could have full sexual relations.
And at various times, an operation of circumcision was discussed to correct this. But in fact, this was found not really to be the case.
Luckily, we have his hunting diary. And I went to top experts on the subject of phimosis, which is what he would have had if he needed an operation. And they assured me, when I showed them the hunting diary, which he wrote, no one who'd had an operation for phimosis without anaesthetic could possibly have gone hunting day after day after day. Without going into details, it's unthinkable.
While Louis struggled to father a child with Marie Antoinette, he also had to address the problem that had blighted the final years of Louis XV's reign, the poor state of the national finances. He hired one of the sharpest minds in Europe, Anne-Robert Turgot, to advise him on the economy.
Monsieur Turgot, le bien de mon peuple. Je veux que cet objectif seul guide tout entier votre action.
France was a society which still lived on the margins of subsistence. Many people still had memories of the terrible famines that had killed millions at the end of the reign of Louis XIV.
Je vous soutiendrai, Monsieur Turgot. Je vous soutiendrai.
Turgot is an enlightened minister who has a particular sense of the importance of landed wealth and the need to tax landed wealth.
Savez-vous ce que représente une telle miche de pain pour les plus pauvres des sujets du royaume?
Je vous croyais en charge des finances, Monsieur Turgot. Je ne savais pas que vous étiez aussi boulanger.
Les 3/4 du budget d'une famille.
Turgot tried to teach the king and his ministers some lessons about life outside Versailles, like the price of bread. Louis was interested. The others, not so much.
Nous allons mettre en œuvre vos réformes, Turgot. Vous ferez préparer les projets de loi.
Louis XVI really does begin his reign with modernizing and adventurous policies. So this is a modern, forward-looking king who would hope to reform France and to help France regain its status in the world, as well as the leading European power.
Louis's enthusiasm for reform was not shared by most of his courtiers. The palace was full of powerful landed aristocrats, many of them Louis's own relatives. If Turgot's reforms went through, they would have to pay taxes like everyone else, for the first time in their lives. And they didn't like that idea at all.
Versailles is becoming an increasingly isolated little world. Nobles who are living uselessly, spending money, relying on court pensions, utterly oblivious to the political issues in France.
Comment vouliez-vous que les tiers états n'en viennent pas au coup d'éclat?
Certain taxes were not paid by the nobility, notably the tie. Poll tax simply wasn't paid by anyone. Now, Louis XVI thought this was wrong and aimed to end it.
Vous croyez donc invincible, Monsieur Turgot?
Ce n'est pas tout, sire.
But Turgot's reforms had to be accepted by France's highest law court, the Parlement. Its members, like most of Louis's own governing council, were outraged by his ideas.
Mais si les parlements refusent d'enregistrer ces nouvelles lois, nous les ferons enregistrer par la force.
Par la force? Vous croyez donc invincible, Monsieur Turgot? On croirait entendre un de ces philosophes dont vous êtes si proche.
Opposition to Turgot's reforms came from within the council, very conservative men who felt that the sorts of things that Turgot was proposing threatened the traditional structure of society, in which nobles and clergy held a privileged position relative to the rest of society.
Imposition rapporterait.
Vous allez trop loin, messieurs. Nous ne pouvons nous mettre à dos tout à la fois la noblesse et le clergé.
C'est assez. Je lirai et vous ferai connaître mon sentiment.
And so he had, if you will, stirred up the hornet's nest of vested interest.
Queen Marie-Antoinette loved to dance and gamble in the most fashionable Parisian salons, where she heard all the gossip against Turgot.
Votre nuit fut-elle bonne?
La fête était magnifique, oui. Je meurs de sommeil, il me tarde de me coucher.
Pour moi, je m'en vais de ce pas remettre ma vie entre les mains de Monsieur Turgot.
Vous savez qu'il se répand un mot de moins en moins couvert que les réformes préparées par Monsieur Turgot ne visent à rien moins qu'à saper les fondements mêmes de la monarchie.
Je vous laisse libre de vos sorties. Laissez-moi libre de mes avis.
Louis, mieux que tout autre, devrait se souvenir que notre société est fondée sur la distinction et la hiérarchie des trois ordres.
One of the most powerful opponents of reform was the king's own brother, the Comte de Provence, known in court simply as Monsieur. He clung to the traditional order of French society, 3 estates under the king, the clergy, the nobility, and the rest, with only the rest paying taxes.
Sur un même pied, la noblesse et le commun.
The gossip in Paris, combined with the strong vocal opposition inside Versailles, began to undermine Louis's faith in Turgot and reform.
Louis XVI must not have known which way to turn because the economists are divided, and fundamentally the issue of is the French state and whether it will survive. Very momentous decisions for a young man to take.
Diable d'homme de Turgot, ne prend-il donc jamais une minute de repos?
He looked initially as if he was going to stand firm. However, his confidence was undermined. Louis XVI lacked the willingness to support him to the bitter end.
Est-ce qu'il ne va quand même pas un peu trop vite?
Vous, Monsieur Turgot, ne savez aller que vent debout.
Despite his promises of support, Louis eventually dismissed the man he'd recruited to save the French economy.
Puissiez-vous ne jamais oublier que c'est sa faiblesse qui a mis la tête du roi d'Angleterre Charles Ier sur le billot.
He is famously said to have remarked, Monsieur Turgot wants to be me. I don't want him to be me. And for that reason, the minister was disgraced.
Je me garderai bien de le faire, mais le public, lui, vous demandera de vous expliquer.
Je n'en ferai rien. J'aime mieux laisser interpréter mes silences que mes paroles.
His treatment of Turgot made Louis look weak and indecisive, labels that would stick. But Louis did have something to celebrate. After 8 years of marriage, he and Marie Antoinette finally managed to start a family. First a daughter, and then an heir to the throne.
The birth of her second child, the Dauphin, was enormously important. She'd produced a son. She'd fulfilled her duty, and that was tremendously important and bolstered her, and the king was extremely pleased. Huge celebrations.
It was seen as a miracle. This little baby really was seen as a savior. He was the boy who was going to save France. The bells rang in Paris, the fountains flowed with wine, the Te Deum was sung. I mean, nothing was neglected.
Pour le bonheur des Français.
Pour répandre en nos cœurs.
Félicité parfaite.
Conserve au ciel protecteur.
Les jours d'Antoinette.
France, tu vas renaître.
Un divin rejeton descendu des cieux.
Que sur un triple autel en célébrant ce jour.
Nos trois divinités bienveillantes.
Les Bourbons, l'Autriche et l'amour.
Aujourd'hui, il ne transporte encore que des animaux. J'ai expressément interdit à Monsieur Montgolfier d'y monter en raison du danger. Mais demain, il transportera des hommes. Soyons-en certains. Il ne faut pas le craindre, mais s'en réjouir.
Louis enjoyed being a father, and for a while began to enjoy being king. But the responsibilities of government weighed upon him every day, especially the urgent need to fill the national treasury. Louis's next attempt to do so arrived at Versailles in the shape of Jacques Necker, one of the wealthiest men in Europe.
Necker is an enormously rich Genevan banker. States like France's, which is having financial problems, finds it terrifically advantageous because it means that he places his personal credit to the benefit of the state. He's seen initially as a sort of miracle man because by establishing confidence, financial confidence, the state can boom.
Necker arrived at an exciting time in Versailles. France's old enemy, England, was struggling with an armed rebellion in its American colonies. A rebellion that Louis wanted to support.
C'est maintenant une véritable guerre d'indépendance.
que mènent les milices américaines contre les troupes anglaises.
La France, sire, ne doit pas s'engager plus.
France, since the defeats of the 7 Years' War, had been desperate to get revenge on England. Louis XVI would like nothing more than to attack the old enemy. But on the other hand, there's a problem. If they do that, are they not supporting insurgents? And indeed insurgents, many of whom were Republicans and avowed Republicans at that. And so it's difficult. And so to begin with, they take a kind of a middle course.
Monsieur Vergennes?
Nous ne pouvons fournir armes et munitions aux insurgés, mais nous pouvons leur donner les moyens d'en acheter à des personnes privées. Le gouvernement n'apparaîtra en rien.
Louis approved the aid, but insisted that everything was done in secret.
Using a certain amount of covert skullduggery, weapons and arms are sent off to help the Americans fight off the British attempt to reconquer the rebellious colonies.
All this assistance to America cost the French government a fortune, money it simply did not have. Louis turned to his new finance minister, and Necker arranged emergency loans from his banking friends. The world's first democratic revolution was being financed by one of the least democratic nations in Europe, a fact that troubled Louis himself.
Ne la laissons pas passer.
Les insurgés américains ne brandissent pas seulement le drapeau de la révolte contre l'Angleterre, les buts qu'ils poursuivent sont opposés aux intérêts de la monarchie. N'ont-ils pas le projet, s'ils remportent la victoire, de créer une république?
L'Amérique est trop loin, sire, pour craindre une contagion.
Les idées aussi voyagent. Pour ce qui est de déclarer la guerre à l'Angleterre, je ne peux m'y résoudre. Mais nous devons nous préparer à une guerre défensive. Nous devons rénover et accroître notre flotte. Pour l'argent nécessaire, ce sera donc l'emprunt, Monsieur Necker.
After 2 years of war, Louis's investment in the American Revolution seemed to pay off when the rebels scored their first great victory at the Battle of Saratoga. He decided that the moment had come to support America publicly and go to war with Britain.
Aucune sorte d'envie de recevoir ce blanc-bec.
Non, je n'hésite pas.
He threw a huge party at Versailles to welcome one of the men who drafted America's Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Franklin.
Les Anglais.
Louis and the nobles of Versailles didn't care that Franklin was a Democrat who did not believe in the rule of kings and princes. What appealed to them was the chance to do down a country they hated so much that they wore its image on their backsides.
The courtiers at Versailles loved Franklin because he was a Sude like they were. They dressed up as shepherdesses, he dressed up as a fur trapper.
Même si aujourd'hui nous vivons dans la nuit, nous avons allumé assez de bougies pour danser en attendant des jours nouveaux.
When Benjamin Franklin arrived in France, he was an absolute celebrity. There was a real sort of frenzy, really, a Franklin mania almost, as everybody wants to be seen with the great man.
Au ciel, il a arraché l'éclair et au tyran le sceptre.
The war may have been successful, but it was costing more every year that it dragged on. Finance Minister Necker had already borrowed up to the hilt and was now struggling to get a grip on royal spending.
Il faut, sire, réduire encore et encore le train de la maison du roi. C'est le prix si nous voulons imposer des économies à l'ensemble de vos courtisans.
War is increasingly expensive, and the French political system is not set up to impose taxes on the people who are best able to pay them. So the fundamental problem of the French state is how do you tax the rich?
Le seul moyen pour restaurer les finances publiques serait de rendre l'impôt obligatoire pour tous, mais vraiment pour tous. Et à ce moment-là, nous aurions le clergé et la noblesse contre nous. Et le Parlement n'enregistrerait pas notre loi.
Necker, after several years in government, had pretty much exhausted the possibility of borrowing. He was aware that it was necessary to raise taxes.
pensions, gratifications et autres.
Necker published plans to get rid of the unnecessary but lucrative jobs enjoyed by the courtiers at Versailles. But even the suggestion of reining in the privileges of the nobles set off a familiar argument.
Écoutez la suite. Toute exception, toute faveur devient tôt ou tard une injustice envers la société.
Comment ce bourgeois protestant ose-t-il écrire de pareilles inepties?
Louis promised to back Necker all the way, just as he had with Turgot.
Je n'admettrai pas une nouvelle opposition comme au temps de M. Turgot. Ceux qui y trouveront à redire, je les casserai comme verre.
Si nous laissons faire Necker, la gloire de Louis XIV cédera bientôt le pas à l'anarchie la plus extrême. Puisque notre ministre se gargarise de mots, nous allons lui retourner.
Je ne suis décidément pas fait pour la colère, et encore moins pour la violence.
Marie-Antoinette encouraged her husband to be strong this time. But once again, he began to dither.
Voilà que vous recommencez comme au départ de M. Turgot.
Je ne me soucie que de vous, Louis. Puissiez-vous cette fois ne pas reculer. Louis XVI was not a decisive man by nature. He was a decent man. He was controlled more by his ministers than previous kings had been, but then he was facing a different situation.
Despite his wife's advice, Louis decided that Necker had to go. The second attempt to confront the French nobility had ended just like the first one, in complete failure. When the British finally gave up fighting in America and recognized the new country's independence, it looked like Louis had achieved a famous victory. But even as Versailles celebrated, his courtiers were whispering that France was not getting what it expected from a war it had financed on borrowed money.
77 navires. Nous avons livré 77 navires aux insurgés américains. Et eux, ces chantres de la liberté, rien, pas un seul chargement de marchandises promises. Je leur aurais fait des dons.
Louis had hoped for an economic boost from the war, but the Americans had other ideas.
Ils leur auraient fait des dons. Ils ont fait savoir qu'ils n'ont aucune intention de rien rembourser.
The Americans preferred to continue to trade with England, so France actually ended up spending an awful lot of money on a war from which it got very little tangible benefit.
Turgot, the ex-minister of finances, says the first gunshot will drive the state to bankruptcy. Well, he's wrong, but he's only wrong by a few years because the impact of that war on French finances is absolutely terrible.
Necker's successor was Charles Alexandre de Calonne, who proposed a new idea. He told Louis that to boost the French economy, he should spend even more.
Vous voulez faire des dépenses quand ce sont des économies que mes peuples attendent.
L'argent est là, sire. Dans le secret des coffres et des tiroirs. Il faut le faire sortir, mais l'abeille ne fait pas son miel avec du vinaigre. Il faut restaurer la confiance du public. C'est seulement quand les financiers et les épargnants auront le sentiment que l'argent coule à flot qu'ils seront prêts à nous confier le leur. Nous devons faire comme si l'argent ne manquait pas. Et c'est à vous...
Calonne's financial policies aggravate the very serious financial problems of the state to breaking point.
Marie-Antoinette had given the French people an heir to the throne, but as an Austrian outsider, she had never been very popular. Now, as the financial crisis deepened, ordinary people came to see her not as their queen, but as a symbol of the selfishness of the aristocratic elite.
It's a truism of history that when there's economic stress, people look round for who to blame. And it was all too easy to blame the Austrian, l'Autrichienne, and that she had an extravagant court, and that
the country people were starving and she was having parties and giving balls. So that's really what caused the major downturn in her reputation.
There's a stream of salacious pamphlets which come out about Marie Antoinette in the 1770s and 1780s. The sorts of things that they'd say, that she has a very wild sex life, frustrated in her relations with the king. She has sexual relations with his brothers. She's the new Messalina. She's the new sort of sexually wild person at court. And this is dragging the monarchy down.
Pour moi, je me suis habituée à tout. On m'a prêté des amants, on me prête désormais des maîtresses. Cela me serait indifférent si l'on ne cherchait ainsi à vous atteindre à travers moi.
One of the innuendos was that Marie Antoinette had an affair with Cardinal de Rohan, who was the court almoner, and he then passed venereal disease on to every woman in the court. That is the sort of thing that went around. It was very gross. The grosser the better.
They make anything that people may put up with today look absolutely mild. They are so gross. They are really lewd, with detail and illustrations. One of the points the satirists made in their pamphlets was that Marie Antoinette had it off with her brother-in-law, the Comte d'Artois. You know, you take a story like she's having it off with her brother-in-law, and then how do you prove she's not? That was the trouble, so everybody liked to believe it. I think the king, who was a very nice man, was very upset by it.
Louis himself was also a victim of the pamphleteers.
Ce sont nos réformes que l'on cherche encore et toujours à abattre. Au reste, voyez ce que l'on fait aujourd'hui de moi. Petit, gros, idiot, empoté, dormeur, buveur, cochon, n'ayant d'autre intérêt que la chasse et la serrurerie, il semble qu'il n'y ait personne moins fait que moi pour diriger la France.
Il suffit d'un ordre, sire, et nous ferons cesser ces publications et punir les coupables.
Non. Non, je ne veux pas que quiconque soit poursuivi en mon nom.
From everything that he read, Louis assumed that the whole country now despised him. But a visit to Normandy to inspect a new port brought a pleasant surprise.
Nous n'attendions plus que votre majesté pour procéder à l'immersion du 9e cône qui servira...
For the rest of his career, he virtually never goes out of the area around Paris. It's almost the only time he sees the rest of his country. And what it shows is he is incredibly popular. There's a sort of popularity which he is utterly unsuspecting of, and he even ends up cheering and clapping himself in the excitement.
He was much applauded in Normandy, and it is said that as he was getting back to Versailles, he said, "I know I'm getting nearer to Versailles because the chairs are much weaker."
As soon as he returned to his court, Louis faced another crisis. Finance Minister Calonne decided that his spend, spend, spend formula had been wrong after all. Now he called for cuts and new taxes for the nobility, the same advice that his ill-fated predecessors had given. And sure enough, the nobles organized themselves to resist taxation all over again.
1787 and 1788 will be characterized by a state that's desperate for financial reform to get out of the situation of bankruptcy which is staring it in the face.
Vous nous entraînez dans la dépense pour ensuite adopter la politique de Necker ou de Turgot.
C'est que ces réformes que le bon sens commande sont indispensables à votre royaume, sire.
Louis believed that Calonne's medicine could save France, but doubted if the patient would ever be prepared to swallow it.
Vous connaissiez la violence des oppositions que nous allions lever contre un tel plan. Comment comptez-vous le faire adopter quand nous savons que Parlement, clergé, noblesse vont se liguer contre?
And it's going to be absolutely vital that Louis XVI, for once in his life, follows through and supports his minister in order to make sure that these plans are accepted, because there is no plan B.
Messieurs,
l'opposition réitérée des parlements à tous nos projets de réforme m'a déterminé à suivre les conseils de M. Calonne. Je suis résolu de convoquer le plus rapidement possible l'Assemblée des notables.
The Assembly of Notables included all the most powerful figures in Louis's realm. They had the authority to see that Calonne's reforms became the law of the land.
Messieurs les notables, les projets qui vous seront communiqués de ma part sont grands et importants.
Calonne's reforms will be introduced to them. They will give it their endorsement, thus showing a degree of almost national support, and the king would go on happily. Of course, it doesn't happen like that. The Assembly of Notables turns into an absolute bear garden, an absolute dogfight.
What Calonne was doing was asking an assembly of privileged people to vote away their own privileges. In other words, asking turkeys to vote early for Christmas. And so inevitably they rejected it.
The king realizes that Calonne has failed to persuade the political elite to go down his route. He gets sacked. The ideas which he proposes are withdrawn. So it's a pretty unmitigated disaster.
Calonne was the third finance minister to fall from grace after trying to make the rich pay more tax. And the third that Louis had supported, only to sack. Trapped between economic disaster and the implacable opponents of change all around him, the king couldn't cope anymore. He suffered a mental breakdown, stumbling around his palace, rambling about the visions that tormented him.
N'ayant plus rien à y mettre, j'en ai fait coudre les poches. Malheureux, cela vous épargnera de les plaindre.
Vous n'êtes que chiant-lit.
Just as his grandfather, Louis XV, was subject to melancholia and depression, Louis XVI seems to enter into a period of really quite deep depression.
Puisque c'est comme ça.
The failure of the Assembly of Notables seems to have affected Louis XVI very badly.
Les réformes nécessaires à soulager le peuple.
He's unable to manage the court and to manage the political situation in a way that he has to do as a king, because he is at the pinnacle of a system which is itself in crisis.
Je vais faire connaître au public nos véritables intentions.
In some respect, from this moment, he lost the control. This was a key moment where his ability to actually be a king and dominate the political agenda was put under question.
Est-ce bien le moment?
Je suis désormais comme un équilibriste sur sa corde raide. Si je fais un pas à gauche, je tombe. Un pas à droite, je tombe aussi.
Louis, c'est à vous de prendre les mesures. C'est à vous d'imposer vos vues.
After the Notables, Louis XVI exhibits the qualities that have gone down the Louis of history. You know, tearful, uxorious, reliant on Marie Antoinette, kindly, indecisive, all that. And there are lapses of reason, which are very unfortunate for the people who have to be with him.
Louis's mental state was hardly improved when somebody sneaked into his private chamber and left him an unwelcome gift: a portrait of the execution of England's king, Charles I.
Louis XVI was dominated by the life of Charles I, who was his direct ancestor. He knew bit by bit, line by line, what happened to Charles. And so people were able to scare him by moving a portrait of the king into his private apartments. But Louis, who had a very sort of mechanical kind of mind, he said, if I avoid the mistakes that Charles made, I won't be executed. He said, Charles was executed because he levied war on his own subjects. I'm not going to do that.
Louis recovered his composure and tried one last time to change the way his kingdom was taxed and governed. He called an unprecedented meeting of all three estates, the nobility, the clergy, and the third estate, who represented the mass of the common people.
Messieurs, ce jour que mon cœur attendait depuis longtemps est enfin arrivé.
In August 1788, the Treasury was bare. The government was forced to summon an Estates General. It really was a last throw of a dice.
Despite their huge numerical superiority, the votes of the Third Estate only counted the same as those of the nobility and the clergy.
You will always have a situation where the two votes of the so-called privileged orders, that is the nobility and the clergy, representing maybe less than 500,000 people, will always outweigh the wishes of the 27.5 million people of the Third Estate. So straight away, you've got a political deadlock as soon as the Estates General meet, and getting out of that deadlock will be what happens over the summer of 1789 that triggers the revolution.
A difficult time grew even worse for Louis and Marie Antoinette, with the death of their eldest son.
Misericordiam adiuvete Dominus gratia Spiritus Sancti.
The death of the Dauphin, the young heir to the throne, is quite a big psychological shock, actually. The king is met by a tremendous amount of support from the nobility. Psychologically, it draws the king and his nobility closer together in a way.
It was a crucial moment. Louis's sudden shift in sympathy back to the nobles meant that their enemies, the representatives of the Third Estate, decided he was never going to help them.
The king is increasingly finding it difficult to distance himself from his nobles and their interests. That's the world he moves in. Versailles is all about being surrounded by nobles. He's hardly ever met his own subjects out of that context. So he's swaying towards supporting the nobles, and Marie Antoinette certainly is swaying towards them.
Vous souvenez-vous de ce que vous avez dit le jour où vous êtes devenu roi?
Mon Dieu, je n'ai pas voulu cela.
Et le jour où vous avez reçu la couronne?
Mon Dieu, qu'elle est lourde.
With negotiations at the Estates General still hopelessly bogged down, the Third Estate sent a group to Versailles to ask for Louis's help.
Sire, ces messieurs du tiers-état souhaiteraient vous voir.
He refused to meet them. It was the final straw.
The Third Estate takes matters into its own hands and declares itself the National Assembly. And this is absolutely critical because it's the first time in modern European history that a representative body has claimed power in the state based on a democratic principle that it represents 80% of the French people.
It was a genuinely radical, revolutionary moment because they were saying they were not going to disperse until France had been given a constitution.
De par le roi, annule comme illégale la délibération du 17 juin par laquelle le tiers-État a pris le titre d'Assemblée nationale. Le roi vous ordonne, messieurs, de vous disperser immédiatement.
C'est la voix de la nation.
Faced with the crumbling of the structure of the old Estates General, Louis XVI decided finally that he would resort to force. As a result, he began to call in troops and to assemble troops around Paris. The whole business was botched. The Parisians, panicked by rapidly rising food prices, decided to defend themselves. As a result, they attacked the Bastille to get the powder.
Fusil volé, la prison de la Bastille prise d'assaut, le gouverneur assassiné, sa tête portée sur une pique dans tout Paris. Et vous avez laissé le roi dans l'ignorance?
Louis was woken in the middle of the night with the news that his people had finally taken up arms against the authorities.
Louis XVI had a choice.
Faites réveiller ceux qui dorment. Je veux tout le monde au conseil.
He could have tried to face down the people of Paris and the National Assembly by force of arms. In other words, he could have risked civil war. If there is one thing that is clear about Louis XVI, is that he refused to take that path. He would not fight or raise his standard against his own people. He knew his English history. He knew what had happened to Charles I. He had no intention of repeating it.
Louis may not have wanted to go to war with his own people, but many of them now wanted to go to war with him. 3 months after the fall of the Bastille, a group of angry Parisians marched on Versailles itself.
Et la foule est armée. On crie partout à mort l'Autrichienne et l'on se promet, pardonnez-moi, sire, de faire rôtir son cœur.
The rioters vowed to kill the one person they blamed for all their troubles, the symbol of the hated rich, Marie Antoinette.
There's no doubt that some elements of this crown had very bloodthirsty thoughts in their mind. Marie Antoinette has become a figure of absolute hatred for the population of Paris at this point.
Marie Antoinette was the main target because she's been the main target for many years now. She was considered that the person really was giving poor advice to Louis XVI, who had been at the origin of the fiscal crisis because of her lavish expenses.
One reason the crowd hated Marie Antoinette was because of a phrase she was said to have uttered when told that the poor had no bread. Qu'ils mangent de la brioche? Let them eat cake.
Marie Antoinette never said, let them eat cake, and she never could have said it. She was brought up in the philanthropic court of Austria, where her mother, Maria Theresa, sort of told them to go around giving soup and bread to old women in farmers' cottages. And it was inconceivable. She would have given the brioche. She was much more like the late Princess Diana, you know. She would have performed a gesture like that. So she could never have said it.
Whoever said what or when, the revolutionaries were after the Queen's blood and were soon breaking down the palace gates.
They broke in the early morning and they tried to climb in the room of Marie Antoinette.
One of her bodyguards is killed actually defending the entrance to her chamber in the palace, and massacred there and then. Marie Antoinette only escapes by a rapid exit into the king's chamber. It is a very, very dangerous moment for the royal family. There was no doubt they must have been terrified. And the king and the queen and their children go out onto the balcony to show themselves, in a sense, to show that they're prisoners and are not fleeing.
Mes amis, j'irai à Paris avec ma femme et mes enfants. C'est à l'amour de mes bons et fidèles sujets que je confie ce que j'ai de plus précieux.
It must have been an absolutely terrifying moment for the king, the queen, and their children, because the crowd is fearsome. They're not used to coming into contact with people like this.
The entire royal family surrendered itself to the revolutionary crowd. and agreed to be taken as prisoners to Paris. None of them would ever see Versailles again.
Famille royale, regardez-les.
Affameur!
Regarde ton peuple, roi! Affameur du peuple. Le peuple français meurt de faim.
They were taken back as the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's son, in reference to the grain and bread crisis that had triggered this. But it's fair to say that after the 6th of October, the king and the royal family were prisoners of the revolution.
Louis had tried and failed to change his kingdom. Now he would pay the price. Both he and Marie Antoinette would die under the blade of the guillotine. For over 100 years, Versailles stood for the power and prestige of the Bourbon dynasty. But it also stood for a society that was fundamentally unfair and corrupt. Romantic, but royally debauched. Glittering, but grotesquely unequal. Magnificent, but profoundly immoral. A society whose time was up.